At 4:12 in the afternoon on a Sunday in Baton Rouge, 36 hours after they took my daughter out of me without a heartbeat, my husband walked into the recovery room with a woman I had never met and asked me to be understanding about the timing. The woman was pregnant. Maybe 5 months. She stood near the door with her hand cupped under the curve of her belly the way I had cupped mine only 3 days earlier, and she would not look at me. "Her name's Danielle," Aaron said, as if that solved anything. "I need you to hear me out. If you want to know what I did instead of falling apart, stay with me to the end, because the part they never saw coming took 6 months to arrive. I have caught babies for 11 years. That is the phrase midwives use, though it never sounds gentle enough to strangers. We do not deliver babies, the mother delivers. We catch. We are the pair of hands waiting at the threshold between one world and the next, and our whole training is the discipline of staying calm when everyone else has run out of calm to spare. A woman in transition needs a voice that does not shake. So you learn to keep your face still while your chest does whatever it wants underneath. I had caught nearly 600 children by the time I lost my own. I knew the sounds a healthy birth makes, and I knew the silence that means something has gone wrong, because I had stood in that silence for other women and held them through it. I never once imagined I would be the woman on the bed. My name is Renee Boudreau, and I met Aaron Whitmore 9 years ago at a hospital fundraiser where I was refilling coffee and he was pretending to enjoy the jazz trio. He was an anesthesiology resident then, all long hands and easy laughter, and he told me midwifery was beautiful work in a tone that meant he thought it was quaint. I married him anyway. I mistook his confidence for depth. That is a mistake you only understand in reverse. We spent 4 years trying to have a child. 4 years is a long time to measure your life in 2-week windows, in temperature charts and disappointment, in the particular loneliness of a woman who spends her days midwifing other people's joy and comes home to a house with an empty second bedroom. I know the fertility world from both sides now, and I can tell you the cruelest part is the hope. Grief you can set down. Hope you have to carry every single month and pick back up when it falls. When I finally got pregnant, I was 38. We named her early, Josephine, after my grandmother, who raised me in a shotgun house off Government Street and taught me that a calm woman is the most dangerous person in any room, though it took me decades to understand she was giving me a weapon and not just a matter. Aaron changed during that pregnancy. I told myself it was stress. He took extra shifts. He stopped coming to appointments after the first trimester. He said the ultrasound room made him claustrophobic, which I now understand was true in a way I did not suspect. It was not the room. It was the future in it. At 34 weeks, at a routine appointment, my colleague Simone could not find the heartbeat. I watched her face do the thing I had trained my own face never to do. I knew before she said it. I had heard that silence 600 times from the other side of it. They induced me the next morning. Aaron was in surgery, they told me. Aaron would come as soon as he could, they told me. I labored for 14 hours to give birth to a daughter who would never cry, and I did it mostly alone, holding the metal rail of the bed so hard the cold of it stayed in my palm for days afterward, and when they finally placed her on my chest, small, perfect, still, I understood that catching is not the same as keeping, and that I had been lying to grieving women for 11 years every time I told them the pain would become bearable. Aaron arrived 4 hours after she was born. He looked at her for less than a minute. He said, "I can't do this right now," and he left the room. I thought he meant the grief was too big. I thought, in the most generous corner of my broken heart, that he simply did not have my training, that he had never learned to stand inside a silence. I made excuses for him even then, lying in a hospital bed with an empty body, my milk coming in for a baby who was gone, which is a cruelty of biology no one warns you about. 2 days later he came back with Danielle. "She's due in November," he said, standing at the foot of my bed in the same green scrubs he'd been wearing when he walked out on our daughter. I didn't plan this. But it's real, and I'm not going to pretend anymore, and honestly, Renee, part of me thinks this, maybe this is the universe balancing things out. One door closes. One door closes. He said that to me. In a recovery room. With the hospital bracelet still on my wrist and my daughter 3 floors down in a place I could not think about. I did not throw anything. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the woman in the doorway, at the way her hand curved under her belly, and the midwife in me, the part trained to stay steady when the world tips over, took the reins from the wife. "How far along were you?" I asked her quietly, "when he told you he was married?" She flinched. That was my answer. Aaron talked for a while after that. I stopped hearing the words. I have since learned there is a specific kind of listening that is really just watching a man reveal the shape of himself while he believes he is explaining his pain. He said he'd been unhappy for years. He said Danielle understood his ambition. He said he hoped we could be adult about the assets, which is a strange thing to bring up in a room where a woman is bleeding. I remember only one clear thought running underneath all of it, steady as a fetal heartbeat on a monitor: he thinks I have nothing. He was not entirely wrong to think so. On paper, Aaron earned 4 times what I did. He drove the German car. He paid the mortgage on the house in the Garden District from his account, and he never let me forget the arithmetic of it, the way he'd sigh at my student loan payments as if I'd bought something frivolous instead of the education that let me catch 600 children. In every conversation about money for 9 years, he had cast himself as the provider and me as the provided for. I had let him. It was easier. And there was something I had never told him, something my grandmother's lawyer had set up before she died, something I had kept the way you keep a spare key sewn into a coat lining, not because you expect to be locked out, but because you were raised by a woman who assumed you eventually would be. But I am getting ahead of the story, and the story is not really about money. The story is about a recording. Here's what I need you to understand about the room I gave birth in. Baton Rouge General runs a program in the labor and delivery wing that I helped design 4 years ago, back when I still believed Aaron and I were building a life. It's called Comfort Audio, a small unit above each bed, meant to play soft music or a mother's chosen soundscape during labor, because I had argued to the board that sound is the last sense to leave a person in crisis and the first to comfort them. The units record too, though almost no one remembers this. They capture the room for quality review and for the rare legal case, and they hold 72 hours before the file overwrites. I wrote the protocol. I knew the retention window by heart because I had chosen the number myself. I did not think of it in the recovery room. I want to be honest about that. In that moment I was not a strategist. I was a woman holding a cold metal rail. It was 3 days later, at home, sitting on the edge of the bathtub because I could not make myself walk past the nursery door, that the thought surfaced with the quiet clarity of a thing I already knew. The Comfort Audio unit had been on during my labor. Simone had switched it to the rain soundscape I liked, hours before we lost the heartbeat. Which meant it had been recording when Aaron finally walked into that room and looked at his daughter for less than a minute. It had been recording what he said. I sat on the cold edge of the tub for a long time. I want to describe what I felt, but the truth is closer to what a midwife feels when the monitor shows a pattern she recognizes, not emotion exactly, but recognition, the body understanding a thing before the mind agrees to it. He had walked out of that room. He had said, "I can't do this right now." But I had been in the worst hours of the worst day of my life, and my memory of it was underwater. What I remembered and what a recording held might not be the same thing. I needed to know what he actually said. Not for revenge. I want to be precise, because I have watched grief curdle into cruelty in other people and I did not want to become that. I needed to know because Aaron had already begun, in the 3 days since, to rewrite it. He had texted me, that he'd been there for the birth as much as he could be, that he'd held our daughter, that he grieved too, in his own way, and that I shouldn't weaponize Josephine in the divorce. Weaponize Josephine. He named her only to accuse me of using her. There is a wisdom my grandmother gave me that I did not understand until that bathtub. She said, "A liar is only dangerous until the day his words are written down." She meant it about a landlord, decades ago. I heard it, that night, about my husband. The next morning I did something I had never done in 11 years. I used my professional standing not for a patient, but for myself. I went to the hospital, badged into the LD wing where I still had privileges, and I sat down with Marcus in medical records, a man I'd trained beside, a man who had watched me talk 3 terrified first-time mothers off the ceiling in a single overnight shift. I did not tell him everything. I told him I needed the comfort audio file from my own labor room, that I was the patient, that it fell within the 72-hour window, and that I had, per the protocol I myself had written, the right to request my own care record. Marcus looked at me for a long moment. He knew what had happened to Josephine. The whole wing knew. He also, I would learn later, knew about Danielle, because hospitals are villages and Aaron had not been careful. "Renee," he said gently, "the window closes tonight. 72 hours. You're sure?" I was sure. I had never been more sure of anything, including the 600 moments I had told a mother to push. He pulled the file. He did it by the book, a formal patient request, my signature, a copy logged. He did not play it. He handed me a small drive in a paper sleeve and said, "Whatever's on there, you didn't get it from me easy. You got it from you. You wrote that policy." Then he did something that undid me more than any cruelty had. He hugged me, the brief hard hug of a colleague, and he said, "I'm sorry about your girl." I drove home with the drive in the cup holder and I did not play it either, not for 2 days. It sat on my kitchen counter next to the condolence casseroles that people bring when they don't know what else to do with their hands. I would look at it and think of the metal rail, the cold that had stayed in my palm, and I could not make myself press play. When I finally did, I sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with headphones on, because I could not bear to let his voice fill the house. The recording opened with the rain soundscape, 40 minutes of it, soft and steady, and underneath it my own breathing, and Simone's voice counting, and the specific rhythms of a labor I mostly could not remember. I made myself listen to all of it. I owed Josephine that. I heard the moment the room went quiet in the particular way I knew, and I heard Simone say my name, and I heard myself make a sound I have never made before or since. I took the headphones off and wept at the kitchen table for an hour, and then I put them back on, because I was not doing this for grief. Grief I could have anywhere. I was doing this for the record. And there, at the 4-hour mark, the door opened, and Aaron came in. I will not transcribe all of it. Some things a woman should be allowed to keep. But I will tell you the shape of it, because the shape is what mattered later. He did not cry. He did not go to me. He stood by the bassinet where they had let Josephine rest and he was on the phone. He thought I was sedated, and I mostly was, drifting, and he said, low, to someone who could only have been Danielle, "It's done. She's out. No, the baby didn't make it." A pause. Then, and this is the part one have played more times than is healthy, don't feel bad. Honestly, this is cleaner. No custody fight, no support payments to 2 households. We can just start. This is cleaner. Over the body of our daughter. That is what my husband said. Then he'd raised his voice for my benefit, the performance beginning, "Renee, honey, I'm here, I'm so sorry, I came as fast as I could," and I heard, on the recording, my own drugged voice trying to answer him, trusting him, reaching for the man I thought he was. That was the sound that decided it. Not his cruelty. My own trust, captured, reaching for a person who was already gone. I took the headphones off and I sat very still. I have described the stillness of a midwife holding a room together. This was the other kind. This was the stillness of a decision already made, waiting only for the paperwork. I did not call a lawyer that night to scream about the recording. I want you to understand the difference between what a wounded person does and what a trained one does, because the whole rest of this depends on it. A wounded person plays the recording for everyone, on social media, at the funeral, into the void, hungry for the world to hate him as much as she does. That satisfaction lasts a day and costs you everything, your credibility, your leverage, sometimes even the sympathy that should have been yours. I had watched families destroy themselves that way. I had seen a father lose custody not because he was unfit but because he could not stop performing his rage. So I did the opposite. I told no one what I had. I let Aaron keep believing I had nothing, no money, no proof, no fight in me. I let him file. He filed 11 days after Josephine's funeral, which he did not attend, sending white lilies with a card that said thinking of you both, the both apparently meaning him and Danielle, and I stood at my grandmother's plot in Roselawn where I had buried my daughter beside her, and I read that card and I felt the last soft thing in me go quiet and useful. Here's what Aaron did not know: the spare key sewn into the coat lining. My grandmother, Josephine Boudreau I, was not the poor woman everyone in Aaron's family assumed I came from. She lived in a shotgun house off Government Street by choice, the way certain people who grew up with nothing choose to keep living small even after the small is no longer necessary. She had spent 40 years buying property in a part of Baton Rouge that everyone else had written off, 3 blocks near the river that the city, 2 years after her death, rezoned and began to develop. She left it all in a trust. She named me trustee and sole beneficiary, and she named her lawyer, an unsmiling woman named Ida Pellerin, as the only other person who knew the full extent of it. I had never told Aaron. Not the mortgage he was so proud of paying, not the student loans he sighed over. He had married a midwife he believed he was rescuing. My grandmother had told me, the last lucid week of her life, let a man show you who he is before you show him what you have. Money doesn't change people. It just turns the volume up on what was already there. I had listened. I had waited 9 years. And Aaron had just shown me exactly who he was. The trust was not the weapon, though. I want to be careful about that, because it would be easy to tell you this is a story about a rich woman who let a fool underestimate her, and that is the least interesting true thing about it. The money mattered only because of what it let me do quietly. It let me hire Ida Pellerin instead of a divorce attorney who bills by the hour and pushes toward whatever settles fastest. It let me refuse Aaron's first offer, and his second, without flinching, because I did not need the house he thought he was generously letting me keep. It let me be patient, and patience, in a divorce, is the rarest and most expensive thing there is. Ida came to my kitchen on a Tuesday, sat at the same table where I'd listened to the recording, declined coffee, and opened a legal pad. She was in her 60s, silver hair cut like she resented every minute it took, and she had drafted my grandmother's trust the same year I graduated nursing school. "Tell me what he doesn't know," she said. "Not tell me what happened." She already knew what happened, the whole village knew. She wanted the asymmetry. She wanted to know the exact size of the gap between what Aaron believed and what was true, because that gap, she told me, was the entire case. I told her about the trust. She nodded once, unsurprised, she'd written it. Then I told her about the recording, and for the first time her pen stopped. "Play it," she said. I played her the 4-hour mark. Just that. She listened with her eyes closed, and when "This Is Cleaner" came through the speaker she opened them and looked at me with an expression I have only ever seen on the faces of people who have decided something on your behalf. "Louisiana is a one-party consent state," she said. "You were a party to that conversation, you were the patient in the room, and the recording was made under a hospital protocol you authored, requested by you through proper channels within the retention window. It's clean. It's admissible if we need it. But we won't need it in court." She capped her pen. "We'll need it in one room, once, with the right person watching his face. Courts are for people who want to win. You don't want to win, Renee. You want him to understand what he did, in front of the one person whose opinion he can't buy or perform his way past. Who is that person?" I thought about it. It was not Danielle. Danielle already knew what he was and had chosen him anyway, which was its own life sentence. It was not his friends, he'd curate them. It was not the court, a judge would sign a paper and feel nothing. "His mother," I said. Ida almost smiled. "Tell me about her." Aaron's mother was named Corinne Whitmore, and the first time I met her, at a Christmas dinner 9 years ago in her house in Spanish Town, she was the most polished woman I had ever seen up close. She wore a cream silk blouse that never wrinkled, pearls that were real, a chignon so precise it looked engineered, and a perfume, Shalimar, that arrived in a room before she did and stayed after she left. She had shaken my hand with two of her fingers, glanced at my off-the-rack dress, and said, "A midwife. How earthy." She spent 9 years making it clear, in that same frictionless voice, that I was a phase her brilliant son would grow out of. When we lost Josephine, Corinne sent a text that read, "These things happen for a reason. Perhaps it wasn't meant to be. Perhaps it wasn't meant to be." About her granddaughter. But here is the thing I knew about Corinne that Aaron, in his certainty, had forgotten I knew. Corinne Whitmore had buried a child. Aaron had a sister, older, who died at 11 days old, decades ago, before Aaron was born. He'd mentioned it exactly once, early on, dismissively, the way people mention old family weather. "My mom lost a baby before me. She doesn't talk about it." He had filed it under ancient history. I had filed it under something else, because I catch babies for a living, and I know that a woman who has buried an infant does not stop being that woman, ever, no matter how precise her chignon. Corinne had never told Aaron the details. That was the family secret, not a scandalous one, just a buried one. His sister had a name. There was a small grave in Roselawn, in fact, 3 rows from where I had just put my own daughter, and I had noticed it the day of Josephine's funeral because I noticed graves the size of bread boxes, Whitmore, and a single date, and a name. Adele. Aaron did not know his sister's name. Corinne had never spoken it to him. But it was carved in granite 400 feet from where he had refused to stand and grieve his own child, and he had no idea. "So the reveal," Ida said slowly, understanding, "isn't the money. And it isn't the recording, not to the court. It's that you're going to make the one woman he spent his life trying to impress understand exactly what her son said over his daughter's body, and she's the only person alive who knows in her bones what that means." "Yes," I said. Ida gathered her legal pad. At the door she turned. "You know he'll try to settle fast now that I've entered an appearance. He'll assume I'm expensive and you're broke and desperate. Let him think it. Let him make his best offer. Then we invite them to dinner." He did exactly what she predicted. Within a week Aaron's attorney sent a settlement proposal so insulting it read like a dare: I would keep my car and my personal effects, waive any claim to the house or his pension, and in exchange he would generously not pursue reimbursement for what he'd contributed to my student loans over the years. There was a clause, an actual clause, requesting that I sign a mutual non-disparagement agreement, which is what guilty men ask for when they want to buy your silence before you've said a word. He wanted the recording buried before he even knew it existed. He just knew, the way liars know, that there was something to bury. Ida did not respond to the offer. She let it sit for 11 days, the same number of days he'd waited after the funeral to file, though I never told her that. She chose 11 by instinct, the way I choose numbers. Then she sent a single line: "My client would like to resolve this amicably and in person. Dinner. The Whitmore family and yours. Neutral ground." Neutral Ground was a private dining room at Jubin's, an old Creole restaurant on Highland where Corinne had held every family occasion for 30 years and where, I knew, she was greeted by name. I chose it on purpose. I wanted Corinne on ground she considered hers, comfortable, unguarded, wearing pearls. There is a rule I've learned catching babies: you do the hard thing in the place the mother feels safest, because safety is what lets a person finally let go of what they're clenching. Aaron thought it was a settlement dinner. He thought I'd caved. His attorney had advised against it. Attorneys always advise against rooms they can't control, but Aaron, who had spent his life certain that any room would bend to him, insisted. He wanted to watch me sign. He brought Danielle, now visibly pregnant, in a red dress, because cruelty at that stage becomes almost a reflex. He could not resist the small, additional wound of making me look at the future across a tablecloth. Corinne came in cream silk, of course, and pearls, and Shalimar, her chignon precise, her handshake still 2 fingers. Aaron's father, a quiet man named Gerald who had spent 40 years being frictionlessly managed by his wife, came too, and sat, and said almost nothing, which turned out to matter. Ida came as my family, which was true. She'd known my grandmother longer than she'd known the law. I wore black, not for mourning but because I wanted no color on me to distract from what was about to be in the room. And I brought one thing, a small laptop in a plain bag, and a portable speaker, because I had learned in 11 years of teaching that people believe what they hear in a room together in a way they never believe a story secondhand. The first 20 minutes were unbearable in the ordinary way. Corinne ordered for the table without asking. Aaron made a show of grief that lasted exactly as long as it took the bread to arrive. Danielle pushed food around her plate. Gerald drank. And then, over the entrees, Aaron's attorney, a nervous man named Boyd who kept touching his tie, slid a folder across the tablecloth toward me and said Aaron hoped we could all sign tonight and begin healing. I did not touch the folder. I said, before I sign anything, I'd like to say one thing about Josephine, since no one at this table has said her name yet tonight. Corinne's face did something small. Aaron said, warningly, Renee. You said, in your text, I went on, calm as a heartbeat monitor, looking only at Aaron, that I shouldn't weaponize our daughter. I've thought about that a great deal. I want everyone here to know that I have no intention of weaponizing Josephine. I only want the record to be accurate. You've told several people you were there for her birth. That you held her. That you grieved. Your mother deserves to know what actually happened in that room, because she's the only person at this table who has stood in a room like it. Corinne's fork stopped moving. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Adele, I said. The name landed in the middle of the table like a dropped glass. Gerald set down his drink. Corinne went absolutely white beneath her powder, the specific pallor of a woman hearing a name she has not heard spoken aloud in 40 years, a name she never told her son. How do you, she started. She's in Roselawn, I said gently, because I meant it gently, this part one did not enjoy. 3 rows from where I buried my daughter. I saw her stone at Josephine's funeral. The one Aaron didn't attend. I turned to Aaron. You don't know your sister's name. You told me once your mother lost a baby and doesn't talk about it. You filed it under nothing. You never once wondered what it cost her, because you've never in your life had to stand inside a silence like that. This is grotesque, Aaron said, standing halfway. You're using my dead sister too. Sit down, Aaron, Corinne said. She did not say it loudly. She said it the way I say push, quietly, with the full weight of a person who has been through the worst thing and survived it, and Aaron, who had never once in his life been overruled by his mother in front of witnesses, sat down. Play it, Corinne said to me, and I understood she'd known, from the plain bag, from the speaker, that there was something to play. Mothers who have buried children learn to read the shape of dread coming toward them across a table. I opened the laptop. My hands did not shake, and I want to be honest about why. It was not strength. It was the recording. I had listened to it so many times that it had stopped being able to hurt me in a new way. It had become evidence, which is a form of scar tissue. I set the speaker in the center of the table, next to the bread, and I said, this is from the comfort audio unit in my delivery room. I designed that program 4 years ago. I requested this file through the hospital's own protocol, within the retention window, as the patient. It's legal, and Ms. Pellerin has the documentation if anyone would like to question that. Boyd, the attorney, opened his mouth and Ida slid a single sheet of paper toward him, and he closed it. I'm only going to play 30 seconds, I said. The part where Aaron came into the room. Corinne, you don't have to listen. But you asked. Play it, she said again. I pressed the space bar. The rain soundscape filled the private dining room at Jubin's, 40 seconds of soft artificial rain, and I watched it change everyone's faces, the incongruity of that gentle sound in a room braced for a blow. Then the door on the recording opened, and my husband's recorded voice, thinking himself alone with a sedated wife and a dead daughter, said, Lo, it's done. She's out. No, the baby didn't make it. A pause the whole table held its breath through. Don't feel bad. Honestly, this is cleaner. No custody fight, no support payments to 2 households. We can just start. Then the performance, tinny and awful through the little speaker, Renee, honey, I'm here, I'm so sorry, I came as fast as I could. And underneath it, worst of all, my own drugged voice, trusting, reaching, you came. You came. I stopped it there. I did not need the rest. The room was silent in the way I know better than anyone at that table. Danielle had both hands over her mouth. Gerald was staring at his son with an expression I can only describe as a man seeing, at 70, the exact shape of the thing he'd spent 40 years declining to look at. Boyd was studying the tablecloth. And Corinne had not moved. A single tear had cut a clean line through the powder on her cheek, and she made no move to wipe it, because she was not crying for the divorce or the money or even the humiliation. She was 40 years back, in her own silent room, hearing a version of the thing that had been done to her done again by her own son. "This is cleaner," she repeated, very quietly. She was not asking. She was testing the words in her own mouth to see if they were real. "Mom," Aaron said. "Mom, that's out of context, I was in shock, I didn't mean." "Do you know," Corinne said, still quiet, still not looking at him, "what your father said to me? When Adele died?" Gerald flinched. "He said we would try again. He said it in the hospital. He thought he was comforting me. And it took me 30 years to forgive him for reducing her to a try again, and he never once, Gerald, said it was cleaner." Her voice did not rise. It got lower, which was worse. "He wept. He held her. He didn't know her name well enough to grieve her properly either, because I never gave him the chance, because I locked it all away. That was my mistake. I raised a son who thinks a dead child is an inconvenience solved. I taught him that. I taught him that grief is untidy and success is clean." She finally turned to Aaron. "Where were you standing when you said it?" Aaron didn't answer. "He was standing next to her bassinet," I said. "Josephine's." Corinne closed her eyes. When she opened them she looked at me, and for the first time in 9 years the two-finger woman was gone entirely, and what was left was just a mother who had buried a daughter, looking at another one. "I owe you an apology," she said, "that is too large to make at a dinner table. Here is where a wounded person would have pressed the advantage. Would have played more. Would have said something cutting to Danielle, or made Aaron beg. I understood the pull of it. But my grandmother taught me a second thing, later than the first, when I was grown: you don't have to burn a man down. You only have to stop being the thing that hides his fire from the people who need to see it." I had shown them the fire. That was all I owed. The rest would burn on its own. So I closed the laptop. I picked up the folder Boyd had slid across the table, the insulting settlement, the non-disparagement clause, the request that I thank Aaron for his generosity, and I set it, unopened, back in front of him. "I won't be signing that," I said. "Ms. Pellerin will be sending a revised proposal in the morning. I think, once your attorney reviews it, you'll find it's in everyone's interest to settle quickly and quietly." I stood. "I didn't come here to take your money, Aaron. I have my own. I never told you that either, and now you get to spend the rest of your life wondering what else you never bothered to learn about me." I put on my coat, the cold weight of it settling over my shoulders. "That's not a weapon. That's just the truth. You married a woman you never once tried to understand, and you're about to raise a child with another one. I hope you do better. For that baby's sake, I hope you become a person who could stand in a silent room." I looked at Danielle, whose face was wet, whose hand was cupped under her belly. "When your time comes," I said, not unkindly, "ask for a doula who isn't afraid of the quiet. It matters more than you know." And I walked out of Jubin's into the wet Baton Rouge night, and I did not look back, and for the first time since the metal rail, the cold felt like air instead of grief. What Aaron never understood, what I think he genuinely could not understand, the way a person born without a sense cannot imagine it, was that I had never needed the money and had never wanted a spectacle. Ida's revised settlement, sent the next morning, was not punitive. It was surgical. I asked for nothing of his. I waived the pension, the house, all of it, and I asked only that he cover the cost of Josephine's headstone and the perpetual care on her plot, in his own name, so that his signature would be attached forever to the daughter he'd called an inconvenience. He signed it within the hour. His attorney, I later heard, had strongly advised him to, and Aaron for once in his life took advice, because Corinne had called him that night and something in that call had changed the temperature of his certainty for good. The divorce was final in 90 days. There was no hearing, no courtroom, no spectacle. It resolved on paper, quietly, exactly as I wanted, and that quiet was itself a kind of verdict, because a loud divorce lets a guilty man feel like a victim of a vindictive wife, and a quiet one leaves him alone with what he did. I have watched enough couples come apart to know that the men who scream recover faster. It's the ones who are met with silence who lie awake. Corinne did not disappear from my life the way Aaron did. This is the part people don't expect when I tell it, and it's the part one care about most. 2 weeks after the dinner, a car came up my street and stopped in front of my house, and Corinne Whitmore got out of it, not in silk, in a plain gray cardigan, no pearls, her hair loose, looking a decade older and somehow more real than I had ever seen her. She stood on my porch and did not use 2 fingers. She used both hands, and she held mine, and she said, "I've been to Roselawn. I sat with Adele for the first time in 11 years. And then I sat with your Josephine, and I told her about her aunt. I hope that was all right. I didn't want either of them to be alone out there. I brought her inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and she told me about Adele. The whole thing, for the first time in 40 years, spilling out of a woman who had cemented it over so thoroughly she'd forgotten there was a person underneath. 11 days. A heart defect they couldn't fix in 1979. The way Gerald had said we'll try again and how she'd let it turn her to granite, how she'd built a precise, frictionless life on top of the grave so she'd never have to feel the ground move again. How she'd raised Aaron in that house of no untidy feeling, and how she saw now, too late, what it had made him. I made him, she said. I made a man who could say cleaner. That's mine to carry. He's grown, I told her. You gave him the start. He chose the rest. My grandmother used to say money turns up the volume on what's already there. I think grief does too. It doesn't make a person cruel. It just shows you what was always in them. You grieved and turned to stone. Aaron grieved and turned to convenience. But there are people who grieve and turn to something softer. He could still be one of them. That's not your job anymore. It was never entirely your fault. She wept at my table, and I let her, because I catch people for a living, and this was a woman finally delivering something she'd been in labor with for 40 years. We are not close, exactly. It would be a lie to wrap this in a bow and tell you my former mother-in-law is my dear friend now. But she comes to Roselawn on Josephine's birthday and on Adele's, and twice she has been there when I arrived, and we have stood together at 2 small graves 3 rows apart, 2 women who understood the silence, and that is a kind of family I did not expect and would not trade. Danielle had her baby in November, a boy. I know because Corinne told me, and because Baton Rouge is a village. I heard the birth was hard and that Aaron, true to form, was called into surgery and arrived late. I heard Danielle asked for a doula. I like to think she remembered what I said over the wreckage of that dinner. I hold no anger toward her. She was 26 and lied to and pregnant, and she has, in Aaron, a life sentence I would not wish on anyone. He will be provided for and performed at and never once truly known, and one day she will discover, as I did, the specific loneliness of being married to a man who is only ever attending his own life. As for the trust, my grandmother's 3 blocks by the river, the development finished the following spring, and the income from it does something I think would have made her laugh her low dry laugh. I used the first year of it to fund a program at Baton Rouge General for bereaved parents, a specialized doula, a private room away from the maternity ward's happy noise, a memory-making protocol, and grief counseling that starts before the parents even leave the hospital, so that no woman ever again has to labor through the worst silence of her life reaching for a hand that isn't there. I named it the Josephine and Adele Fund. Corinne cried when I told her. Then she wrote a check that matched mine, in Gerald's name and hers, and for the first time the two of them did something together that was not clean and controlled but wide open and unbearably sad and good. I keep the recording. People ask me sometimes, the few I've told the whole story to, whether I've deleted it, whether I want to, whether keeping it means I haven't moved on. They don't understand. I don't keep it to listen to. I've never played it again after that dinner, and I won't. I keep it the way I keep my grandmother's spare key sewn into the coat lining, not because I expect to be locked out again, but because I was raised to understand that the world will sometimes require you to prove what happened, and a woman who can prove it is never again at the mercy of a man who can rewrite it. It sits in a safe deposit box at the bank on 3rd Street, and I think about it maybe twice a year, and both times the thought is calm. I went back to work 8 weeks after Josephine. People thought it was too soon. My supervisor gently suggested I take more time. But I have caught nearly 700 children now, and I can tell you that the only way I know to survive a silence is to fill the next room with a cry. The first birth I attended after I came back was a first-time mother named Alicia, 19, terrified, no partner, her own mother in the waiting room because Alicia had asked her to wait outside. I held her hand for 14 hours. When the baby crowned and I felt the specific give of a life coming through into the world, when I caught him and he screamed the way the living scream, I put him on Alicia's chest and I watched her face do the thing that faces do, and I stepped back to the sink to wash my hands, and I cried into the running water where no one could see, not from grief, but because a room that could have been silent was full of noise, and I had been the hands at the threshold, and that is still, after everything, the only work I have ever wanted to do. I understood something at that sink that I want to leave you with, because it took me the whole ordeal to arrive at it. For years I had thought my grandmother's lessons were about protection: hide what you have, wait, watch, keep the spare key. I thought she'd raised me to be armored. But standing at that sink with another woman's living son screaming behind me, I finally understood she'd raised me to be free. The point of the hidden trust, the point of the silence, the point of never showing a man what you have until he's shown you who he is, none of it was about revenge, and none of it was even really about safety. It was about never needing anyone's permission to walk out of a room. Aaron had spent 9 years believing he held the power in our marriage because he held the money, and the truth was I could have left him at any moment of any of those years and simply chose, over and over, to stay and try. That is the thing that undid him at the dinner table, more than the trust, more than the recording. It was learning that every day of our marriage had been my choice and not my dependence. Men like Aaron can survive being left by a woman who needs them. What they cannot survive is learning she never did. There's a wisdom my grandmother never said out loud but lived so completely I absorbed it anyway, and I only found the words for it at that sink: the people who love you meet your silence with patience. The people who use you meet it with a bill. Aaron met every silence of our marriage with an invoice, the loans, the mortgage, the car, a ledger of everything he'd provided, as if love were a debt I was slowly failing to repay. I had spent 9 years quietly paying an emotional balance I never actually owed. It took a recording of him standing over our dead daughter, calling it cleaner, to finally show me the account had always been fraudulent. Corinne sold the house in Spanish Town a year later. She told me she couldn't live anymore in rooms she'd kept so precise, and she moved into a smaller place near the river, not far, as it turned out, from my grandmother's 3 blocks, which I found unbearably fitting and never mentioned to her. Gerald, freed somehow by that terrible dinner, started talking. Really talking, Corinne said, for the first time in 40 years. They are, in their 70s, learning to be untidy together. She sends me photographs sometimes of the two of them doing ordinary things: a farmer's market, a botanical garden, a mess of a kitchen where they're clearly failing to cook something. In every photo Corinne's hair is loose. She has not worn the chignon since the dinner. I don't think she owns the pins anymore. Aaron reached out once, about 8 months after the divorce. A long email, the kind guilty men write at 2 in the morning when the performing exhausts them. He said he'd been in therapy. He said he understood now what he'd done, that he thought about that recording every day, that he wanted to apologize properly. He said he hoped that someday I could forgive him, and, this is the part that told me the therapy had not yet reached bottom, He said forgiving him would help me heal too. Still an invoice. Even the apology was framed as a service he was offering for my benefit. I read it twice, standing at my kitchen counter in the gray morning light, and I felt the old pull to answer, to correct him, to explain the difference between an apology and a request. And then I understood I didn't owe him even that explanation. I did not reply to Aaron's email. Not out of cruelty, and not out of some frozen refusal. I'd watched Corinne live 40 years inside a refusal and I wanted no part of that granite. I simply understood, finally, that his healing was not my labor to attend. I had spent my whole life catching other people through their hardest passages. I did not have to catch him. Some deliveries you are not the midwife for. I let the email sit in a folder and I went to work, and I caught a baby that afternoon, a girl, and her mother named her after no one in particular, just a name she liked, and I thought, good. Start fresh. Oh, no one your name. I forgave Aaron eventually, though not in the way he wanted and not in a way he'll ever know about. Forgiveness, I've learned, is not a certificate you hand the other person. It's a weight you set down on your own side of the room so you can finally use both hands. I set it down on Josephine's second birthday, at Roselawn, kneeling in the grass by her small stone with the perpetual care receipt that carried his signature, and I said out loud, to her and to no one, that I was done carrying what he did. The forgiveness was for me. He is not entitled to know it happened, any more than a landlord is entitled to know you stopped being afraid of him. The Josephine and Adele Fund is in its third year now. We've served over 200 families. The private room is real, pale green walls, the color I chose because it's the color of the Comfort Audio program's logo, a small private joke I've never explained to anyone. There's a rocking chair and soft light and a protocol, written by me, that says no bereaved parent labors alone, ever, and that a trained hand is at the threshold whether the passage ends in a cry or in silence. 2 of the doulas I hired were bereaved mothers themselves. I found they're the best at it. They're not afraid of the quiet. They've lived in it. They know it doesn't kill you, and they can say so with their whole bodies, which is worth more than any words I could train into them. I gave a small talk at a regional midwifery conference last fall about the program, and afterward a young midwife came up to me, maybe 26, and asked how I'd found the strength to build something out of losing my own daughter. I get asked that a lot, and I usually say something gentle and true about grief and meaning. But that day I was tired and honest, and I told her the real answer. I didn't build it out of losing her, I said. I built it out of the silence in the room. My husband walked into that silence and found it inconvenient. I walked into it and found my whole life's work waiting there. Same room. The silence doesn't tell you who you are. It just stops letting you pretend. She wrote it down. I hope she uses it. I hope she never needs it. I bought a house last year, my own, with my own money, no man's ledger attached to a single brick of it. It's small, off Government Street, 3 doors down from the lot where my grandmother's shotgun house used to stand before the city took it and the trust let me quietly buy back the land it sat on, which I keep empty, planted with the same fig tree she grew, because some things you keep not to use but to remember. My house has a room I painted pale green. It is not a nursery and it is not a shrine. It's a room with a rocking chair where, twice a month, I meet with bereaved parents from the program who want to talk to someone who's been on the bed and not just beside it. We sit in the good light and I let them be untidy. I let them say her name as many times as they need to. I have caught nearly 700 children into life and I have learned, late, that you can also catch the living as they come back from the worst thing, that the hands at the threshold are needed on the way out of grief as much as on the way into the world, and that this, too, is a delivery. On the anniversary this year, Corinne met me at Roselawn without our planning it. She was already there when I arrived, standing between the 2 small stones, Adele's and Josephine's, in her gray cardigan, her hair loose and gone fully silver now. She'd brought 2 small bunches of the same white lilies Aaron had once sent me as an insult, and she'd put one at each grave, reclaiming the flower somehow, making it mean the thing it was supposed to mean. We stood there a long while. We didn't talk much. Two women who had buried daughters, 40 years apart, standing in a silence neither of us was afraid of anymore. I used to think, Corinne said finally, that if I never said her name, I'd stop feeling it. 40 years. It doesn't work. It just makes the name heavier when it finally comes out. She looked at me. Thank you for saying it. At that terrible dinner. You gave me my daughter back by saying her name in a room full of people, and I'll never be able to repay that. You don't owe me anything, I said, and I meant it in a way Aaron would never have understood, not as a transaction forgiven, but as a plain truth. Between us there was no ledger. There never had been. That's how you know the difference between the people who love you and the people who bill you. Love doesn't keep the receipt. We walked out of the cemetery together into a clear cold morning, and at the gate we stopped, and Corinne took both my hands in both of hers, and neither of us said anything, and then we got into our separate cars and drove our separate ways home, two free women, each carrying a name that no longer needed to be buried, each on our way to fill some future room with whatever the day required, a cry, a silence, a hand at the threshold, held out for whoever came next. If you've ever been the person in the room everyone assumed had nothing, no money, no proof, no fight, I'd love to hear how you found your own quiet way to stand up. Tell me in the comments. Somebody scrolling tonight needs to know it can be done without ever raising your voice.